In today's video, let us study about the cortical branches which will supply the cerebral cortex, the frontal, parietal, temporal and the occipital lobes. So the main cortical branches are coming from three sources, only three sources. So already we have discussed the circle of Willis in our last video. Please refer the video for better understanding of the area supplied. Now, the three cortical branches, the three main sources of the cortical branches are coming from the anterior cerebral. One is the anterior cerebral artery, the second one is the middle cerebral artery, and third one is the posterior cerebral. These three branches are going to give the cortical branches which will anastomose around the cortex and supply the entire cortex. First, we'll study about the region supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Using a sagittal section, we can study the course of the arteries. We can see this is actually the circle of Willis, and you can see this is actually the anterior cerebral artery. So this anterior cerebral artery is in relation to the corpus callosum. You can see it is winding around the corpus callosum. So this is the anterior pole, the frontal pole, it is winding around the corpus callosum. You can see it is crossing almost 3/4 of the length of the corpus callosum, and it is supplying through all around the medial aspect, all the parts of the medial aspect of the cerebrum, both the frontal and the parietal lobes, supplying the medial aspect up to a few centimeters from the midline. So it is supplying this region. That is about the anterior cerebral artery.
For better understanding of the branches of the artery and the functional areas which are related to the cerebral hemisphere which is supplied by the artery, we can draw a schematic diagram. Here we are drawing a medial section, and this is the medial view of the cerebral hemisphere, and the yellow color represents the area supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. This yellow color region represents the area supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. And now we can see the branches of the anterior cerebral artery.
So this is a diagram to represent the anterior cerebral artery. So you can see this anterior cerebral artery is found in relation to the callosal sulcus. So once it reaches the posterior pole of the corpus callosum, posterior pole of the corpus near the splenium, it will ramify and it will supply the posterior part of the parietal lobe. So it will supply the posterior part of the parietal lobe, and also it will anastomose with the posterior cerebral artery, which will be supplying the inferior part. We'll study it later. So during its course, it gives so many branches. So it gives branches to the inferior part of the frontal lobe, and this branch is called the orbital branches. These are the orbital branches. Orbital branch, and it gives some frontal branches. These are the frontal branch. Then gives a calloso-marginal branch. It will give a calloso-marginal branch which will run along the cingulate sulcus. It will run along the cingulate sulcus. This is a calloso-marginal branch which will run along the cingulate sulcus. This is the calloso-marginal branch. This is a calloso-marginal branch. Then from the calloso-marginal branch, there are so many branches which will be supplying the frontal region and the parietal region. You can see so many branches which will be supplying the frontal and the parietal region emerging from the calloso-marginal branch. Then the direct continuation of this anterior cerebral artery after the callosal marginal branch, is given, and this branch is called the pericallosal artery. This is called the pericallosal artery. This is called the pericallosal artery. So these are the branches of the anterior cerebral artery. So these are all the branches of anterior cerebral artery. You can see in yellow. So these are the branches of anterior cerebral. You can see the anterior cerebral artery is mainly supplying the frontal region. This is the medial aspect. Medial aspect of the frontal region, the medial aspect of the parietal region, entire parietal region, and the corpus callosum. So now we have to know what are the motor and the sensory areas related to this region so that we can understand the lesions produced by it. As we know, this is actually the paracentral gyrus. This paracentral gyrus, anterior part, this is the central sulcus. This is the central sulcus. So anterior to the central sulcus, all the areas what we see is mostly motor in function. Posterior to the central sulcus, all the areas we see is mostly sensory in function. If we see anterior to the central sulcus, that is at the paracentral lobule, we have area number 4. Here we have the motor area which represents the lower extremity of the body, mainly starting from the foot, the leg, then we have the pelvis and the perineum. Okay, so these areas, the motor function will be lost if this artery is infarcted, if this artery is obstructed because of an embolus or or if there is a cerebral bleed which is affecting the anterior cerebral artery, this area is damaged. This area is damaged, which will cause loss of motor function of the foot, leg, and the lower part of the body. Next, if you go behind the central sulcus, this has the area number 312, which has the sensory area for the lower part of the body, mainly the groin, the foot, the leg, and the pelvis. So this area, when it is affected, we have sensory loss. We have sensory loss. There can be loss in the control of micturition and all these kind of sensory disturbance will be there when this area is affected. So mainly the lower half of the body, the sensory aspect is lost, sensory function is lost. Next, coming to this gyrus, there is a medial frontal gyrus. Coming to medial frontal gyrus, it mainly contains the supplementary motor area. It mainly contains a supplementary motor area. So it is also motor in function, and the anterior part of the frontal lobe has the function which represents the social behavior of a particular individual. If this anterior part loses its blood supply, then the patient may have violent behavior. They can't accustom to the social environment, like their social inhibition will be lost. Like a person who is completely drunk, what all activities he'll do, those kind of manifestations will be there in a infarct which affects the frontal part. Next, the supplemental motor area is responsible for assumption of posture of the body, then turning the head to the opposite sides, and the posture of the trunk and also the lower limb. So it is mainly for maintaining the posture, mainly responsible for the maintaining the posture. So if the anterior cerebral artery is affected, the frontal cortex, which is controlling the social behavior, the supplementary motor area, which is actually controlling the posture, then the paracentral lobule, the anterior part, which is controlling the motor activity of the lower part of the body, and the paracentral lobule on the posterior aspect, which will control the sensory part of the lower half of the body, will be paralyzed. Okay, that is the applied importance of the anterior cerebral artery and the functional areas related to it. If you see the supralateral surface of the brain, this is a supralateral surface. Here we can see the anterior cerebral artery crossing the midline. It also supplies little bit part of the superior aspect of the cerebral cortex of the frontal, the frontal and the parietal lobes. We can see it is actually controlling the prefrontal area, which controls the social behavior. It also here in the premotor cortex, here it also controls the fine hand movements. So if this is lost, the fine hand movements will be lost, like drawing skills, like writing skills, etc. Then here the upper part of the precentral gyrus, in front of the central sulcus. Already I told you, in front of the central sulcus, it's all motor in function. So the motor area up to the lower part of the body, the motor function of the lower part of the body is lost. Similar, like what we said in the paracentral lobe, same thing, the lower limb, the pelvis, and the lower part of the trunk, the function will be lost. Similarly, behind the central sulcus, in the sensory cortex, that is the postcentral gyrus, we have area number 312, and the lower part of the trunk sensation will be lost. Now, behind the postcentral sulcus, we have the parietal lobe. This parietal lobe is divided into superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule. Here, the superior parietal lobule is supplied by anterior cerebral artery. So, this superior parietal lobule has got area number 5 and 7, which is actually sensory association area. So, this area is sensory association area, and this sensory association area will be controlling the stereognosis. So, what is stereognosis? It is actually, the stereognosis is the perception of size, shape, roughness of a particular object. Okay, can be perceived by using this area. So, stereognosis function will be lost if the anterior cerebral artery is infarcted. So, what all things are affected? So, the prefrontal area, the social behavior, the fine hand movements, then we have the motor activity, motor part of the lower part of the body, sensory of the lower part of the body, then the stereognosis. Okay, so that is about the supralateral surface which is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Coming to the inferior surface supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, we can see the area adjacent to the anterior median fissure on either side is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. So, here also the motor, it is also having the motor area, and the social behavior skills will be present here. Areas will be present here. So, that will be affected if this area is infarcted. So, this is about the area supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Next, we will study about the area supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Next, coming to the middle cerebral artery is the direct continuation of the internal carotid artery here, and it is the largest branch. Here it enters inside the stem of the lateral sulcus. The middle cerebral artery which is going into the stem of the lateral sulcus. As we see, it is giving many branches as it goes into the depth of the stem of the lateral sulcus. It gives many branches onto the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and here inferiorly to the temporal lobe. So, along the lateral sulcus, the entire region along the lateral sulcus here, around the lateral sulcus, up to the frontal lobe is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So, it is going along the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. During its course, it gives many branches which will be supplying the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and the parietal lobes. So, this green color represents the area supplied by the middle cerebral artery. And this middle cerebral artery controls so many functions. Starting from the frontal lobe, if we see the area number 8 and 9, which is mainly responsible for the head rotation and contralateral eye movements, the frontal eye field. So, this area is the frontal eye field. We have the contralateral eye movements and the head rotation, which this area is supplied by the anterior branches, which are coming from the middle cerebral artery. Then, here in the inferior frontal gyrus, we have Broca's area. Broca's area is nothing but the motor speech area. Motor speech area is responsible for the articulation and the production of sound. Like example, if I am asking a question to a particular person, he has to respond, and this sound, the answer is produced by the Broca's area. The processing will be happening in the vernix area. So, whatever area which is present in front of the central sulcus, already we have mentioned, it is all motor in function. So, area number 44 and 45 is Broca's area, otherwise the motor speech area, which will produce the sound which is required to communicate. Okay. Next, coming to the precentral gyrus. The lower part of the precentral gyrus, starting from the motor function of the upper limb, hand, then the head and neck, face, tongue and the pharynx, including the swallowing area, is all supplied by the branches coming from the middle cerebral artery. So these motor functions are all controlled by the middle cerebral artery. Next, in the post-central gyrus, so behind the central sulcus, so everything should be sensory. So behind the central sulcus, there is a post-central gyrus. So the middle cerebral artery area supplies, branches from the middle cerebral artery will supply the sensory function of the upper limb, hand, face, lips, tongue, pharynx, etc. Okay, so all the sensory functions, including the fine touch, temperature, pain, including the proprioception, everything will be controlled by this area, and this area is supplied by the branches coming from the middle cerebral artery. Next, then along the upper lip of the, we can call this area, the upper margin of the lateral sulcus, of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, we have area which actually senses the pain, which is coming from the frontal to coming from the face, that is the front backwards, like face to leg, in that direction. Anteriorly, we have the area which is controlling the pain sensation of the face, then posterior most will be the leg. So it is in that order the body is represented. So the pain is controlled there, and that area is also supplied by middle cerebral artery. Then along the posterior aspect, just at the posterior aspect of the terminal part of the post-central gyrus, here we have area number 43, which is present in the inferior parietal lobule. So you can see the inferior parietal lobule is entirely supplied by middle cerebral artery. We have the area for taste, area number 43. Okay, that is also supplied by middle cerebral artery. And along the posterior aspect of the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe, we have area number 39 and 40, which is actually the vernix area, otherwise called the sensory speech area. So the auditory and the visual impulse which we receive will be processed in the sensory speech area to produce an appropriate response, and the response will be brought about by the motor speech area through the connecting fibers. Okay, so this area is the vernix area, otherwise the sensory speech area. If the sensory speech area is paralyzed, it will cause sensory aphasia. If the Broca's area is paralyzed, it will cause motor aphasia. Okay, so this area is also supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So we can easily remember what all functions will be lost if the middle cerebral artery is infected. Okay, along the frontal and the parietal lobe. Now coming to the temporal lobe, we can see temporal lobe along the superior temporal gyrus, we have the primary auditory area, which is area number 41 and 42. So the hearing will be impaired if this area is affected because of the loss of blood supply. And second, so this area is mainly responsible for a perception of loudness, quality, pitch of sound, and also the source of the sound. Next, we have surrounding that along the superior temporal gyrus itself, we have area number 21. So this area number 21 is the secondary auditory area. This secondary auditory area receives the impulses which are coming from the primary auditory area, and here it correlates with the past auditory experiences. Okay, here this area correlates the sounds which are already heard. Okay, will be easily recognized through area number 21. So if you hear a voice of a person, you can recognize the person who is producing that sound. And one more thing, if this area is affected, it will cause word deafness. This word deafness can be otherwise called as auditory verbal agnosia. Okay. So that usually in the word deafness, what happens is, since the past learnt experience is not processed here, so we'll have difficulty in interpreting the meaning of a sound which is already actually familiar to us. So even if it is familiar to us, we can't interpret the meaning of the particular sound. So that is called word deafness. Okay. Next, coming to the anterior pole, we have area number 38. Okay, anterior pole, we have area number 38, which is actually responsible for a semantic memory. That is a memory of remembering meanings, names, etc. Okay, and even this area is responsible for social and emotional processing of information. Okay, so all these things will be lost if there is middle cerebral artery infarct. In the medial surface, the middle cerebral artery only supplies a small region of the temporal pole, which is actually having the area number 38 and 28. 38 will be in the anterior pole, 28 is related to the parahippocampal gyrus. This parahippocampal gyrus here, area number 28, is responsible for olfactory function. Okay, so these are all the areas supplied in the medial aspect. Next, coming to the inferior aspect, you can see the middle cerebral artery is represented in green. It is supplying the anterior part of the temporal lobe, including the parahippocampal gyrus, anterior end of the parahippocampal gyrus, and also the lateral aspect of the frontal lobe, along the orbital surface of the frontal lobe. So that is about the area supplied by the middle cerebral artery. The last artery which we are going to see is the posterior cerebral artery. This is the posterior cerebral artery. If you see the posterior cerebral artery, this is the posterior cerebral artery. You can see the posterior cerebral artery. It is coming from here. It is going in relation to the temporal lobe and the lateral aspect of the brain stem, going deep to this area, and it is giving many lateral branches along the inferior aspect of the temporal lobe. Then you can see it emerging here, and it is giving two main branches which will be going along this sulcus. This is a parieto-occipital sulcus. So one branch is going along the parieto-occipital sulcus, the parieto-occipital branch, and another branch is going along the calcarine sulcus. This is a calcarine branch. You can see this is actually the calcarine branch. If you see this calcarine branch, it is mainly supplying this visual cortex. This is a visual cortex. And the continuation of the artery goes along the splenium of the corpus callosum, end by supplying little bit the rest of the part of the parietal lobe also. So the posterior aspect of the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe is mainly supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, which we are seeing here. Once it reaches the medial aspect, it goes posteriorly. Once it reaches the splenium, it gives a larger branch which goes towards the calcarine sulcus, and this is called the calcarine branch. It is called calcarine branch. And then the artery continues postero-superiorly to supply the posterior aspect of the posterior and the superior aspect of the occipital lobe, and this artery is called parieto-occipital branch. It also supplies the parietal area, posterior aspect of the parietal area, by anastomosing with the branches coming from anterior cerebral artery. It is the parieto-occipital branch. During its course, the main trunk gives many temporal branches which will supply the temporal aspect of the cerebral hemisphere. Next, the calcarine branch will be mainly supplying the area number 17, 18 and 19. The calcarine branch mainly supply the area number 17, 18 and 19, which is the 17 is primary visual area, which will be having the macular vision. This area is mainly responsible for the macular vision, and 18 and 19 are visual association areas. The visual association areas will help to identify the object using the past memories from the previous visual memories. Consider if the posterior cerebral artery is thrombosed, the visual area is damaged. even though the visual area is damaged, which has to cause the hemianopia, still the area in the macular vision is still preserved because it is also supplied by a part of the macula is also supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So the macular sparing will be there in isolated lesion of posterior cerebral artery. So this is about the area supplied by the posterior cerebral artery in the medial aspect. Coming to the supralateral aspect, we can see this is the area supplied by the posterior cerebral artery by the branches which are coming through the inferior aspect, and it will be supplying the temporal and the occipital lobe, and it will be supplying temporal and the occipital lobe. Here also the area which is mainly involved is the visual cortex, area number 17, 18 and 19. Next, coming to the inferior aspect, the posterior aspect of the temporal lobe and the occipital part is supplied by this posterior cerebral artery, except the anterior part of the temporal pole is spared. Temporal pole is actually supplied by the middle cerebral artery. Rest of the part on its posterior aspect of the temporal lobe and the occipital pole is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So that's all about the blood supply of cerebral hemisphere. We have covered the cortical branches which is supplying the cerebral cortex. Thank you.